That morning gave a whole new meaning to the word hangover. We decided to walk it off all the way back to London. But the headache didn't end there, it just went on and on and on. Talk about this one.
With Theresa May trying out the idea that negotiations with the European Union might extend for a few extra months, and the backlash against that, it seems like as good a time as any to kind of recap and lay out the whole Brexit situation. Now, I'm doing this primarily for Americans, people elsewhere other than the UK, so by necessity, in order to keep this video relatively short, I'm going to skim over a few things. Now, obviously, as a Remainer, I have a certain degree of bias, and while I'm not going to pretend otherwise, I'm going to try and separate the bald facts of the matter from my personal prejudice. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to avoid having a little dig here and there, but the facts are going to be the facts, and the opinion is going to be the opinion, and you'll probably be able to tell the difference between the two. So, depending who you ask, you'll hear different answers to what is the EU. From certain quarters, you might hear that it's a conspiracy by international Jewry to take over the world or something, and from the other side you might hear that it's some sort of evil globalist capitalist plot or something. What it is, regardless of whether any of these things are true or not, is an economic and political alliance of 28 European nations, soon to be 27. There is a common economic policy, so that as a bloc the EU can negotiate with a lot more strength with other trading blocs and countries. There's a commonality in terms of standards and production of goods and services and so on, so that these goods and services can transit far more easily between the European nations. It's a free trade area, so there's no tariffs and so on within the EU. Things that are to do with the EU on all of these European nations on a larger scale are decided upon politically at that level, while countries who are part of the EU retain a great deal of autonomy. This varies from nation to nation according to their treaties and so on when they join the EU, but there has been a general arrow of homogenisation of rules and so on. Some people don't like this, tending to be nationalists for the most part. There's a wing on the left that is anti-globalist, anti-capitalist, to the extent that they will attempt to sabotage what I tend to think of as an internationalist project. How did this all come about? Well, partly due to a sort of post-war consensus that we don't want anything like this to happen again. You can view it in some ways as being somewhat similar to the United Nations in that regard, a way of getting countries to talk to each other and to cooperate, to help each other out, to prevent the rise of another fascist state in the future and so on. And this is why you'll see the EU using internal sanction against members such as Hungary, who have taken steps to repress their native media, arrest journalists, take a more racist, nationalistic kind of stance towards immigration, and so on. And the other big thing about the EU is that if your country is a member of the EU and you're an EU citizen, in effect, then you can travel to any other country in the EU and work and so on. So that's a big thing. So that's what the EU is. It's a rather loose social, economic and political union of nations. For a very long time, swathes of Britain have been anti-Europe. Some of this is like a kind of hangover from World War II, setting ourselves up in opposition to Germany and the continent and what we see as imperial ambitions stemming from there, kind of in the same way that McCarthyism has crippled any decent discussion about socialism or left-wing politics in the US for generations. That's only just now starting to enter the public consciousness. So there is a kind of innate suspicion of continental Europeans in Britain, in part because of World War II. There's also the fact that there's that famous quote by Steinbeck, again referencing America, that the reason socialism has never taken off in America is because Americans don't think of themselves as an oppressed or downtrodden proletariat. They think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. In a similar way, the British tend to view themselves as a kind of, well, a certain quarter of the British tend to think of themselves as a temporarily embarrassed empire, and to think that we're far more important and influential on the world stage than we actually are anymore. We had a lot of that particular stuffing knocked out of us during the Suez Crisis, and Brexit may well knock the last of that stuffing out of us, but it remains to be seen. Coupled with that, you've had the fact that the Murdoch media has consistently been anti-Europe and has spread all kinds of bullshit about it. Why? Well, when Murdoch comes to talk to our government, they listen. When he comes to talk to the European Union, that level of politics just dismisses and ignores him. So he has a vested interest in being anti-Europe, at least when it comes to the UK. Certain businessmen, certain others have been anti-EU, and for a very long time, successive governments have blamed the EU for all sorts of decisions that they have made. Like, you may have heard that the EU has stripped us of our ability to control immigration. That's not true. There are all kinds of controls that we could have brought in, but that we didn't, because we need those workers. But the government has blamed the EU as a kind of scapegoat upon which it can project all these decisions that they themselves have made. So you've got a bunch of working class people as well who have been whipped up against the EU, supposedly because of this immigration, when it's not the EU's fault particularly. And there are opportunities that were never there before for the British to go and work abroad as well. This was true even earlier, even before Tighter Union. The comedy series Auf Wiedersehen Pet was based on the idea of the Brits going over to Germany to work on building sites and so on. And that's going to be taken away from a lot of people because immigration and emigration is all set to become a lot tighter. So Brexit was a referendum in this atmosphere that I have sketched out for Britain to leave the EU, to cease participation in the European Union, to withdraw from it, from that union of nations, and become a completely and fully independent nation. Again, this is controversial for a number of reasons. There was a lot of illegality in the elections, in the referendum, mostly on the part of Vote Leave, it must be said, but some on the part of Vote Remain. A bunch of lies. Nobody really knew what they were voting for until after the vote. And there you go. We voted extremely narrowly to leave. The vote itself is controversial, not just because of the illegality, but because it was so narrow. Normally such huge constitutional change in other nations that undertake public votes like this requires a 2/3 majority. We only got 52 to 48, roughly. All the lies and so on, it has been a big issue and has been an ongoing issue. The people who orchestrated the Leave campaign have ended up distancing themselves from it, except possibly Farage and Boris, who are using it as an opportunity. And Brexit has fractured British society along many, many different lines. Class, wealth, urban, rural, England versus Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland. It's a huge clusterfuck. It's an insoluble problem for the government to unwind. Okay, so why is it so insoluble? There should never have been a vote in the first place. The referendum was a kind of pledge from the Tories, but it was done, it was held for internal party political reasons. David Cameron thought that Remain would win. This would put this to bed. This would get the Eurosceptic wing of the Tory party off his back. He misjudged terribly and immediately left the building on fire. It's your mess, you deal with it. Of course, the Conservatives were still in power. There wasn't an election then, as there probably should have been. And Theresa May ended up taking over. She now had the poison pill, and she had been pro-Remain in the campaign, but probably only in support of the Prime Minister and in terms of party politics. When she was Home Secretary, she certainly had her wrangles with the EU, so I don't think she's particularly pro-EU, because she wanted to abrogate all kinds of human rights legislation and things while she was Home Secretary, so I think she has her problems with the EU. I also think she feels bound by party politics. So it should never have happened. It happened for all the wrong reasons, and it got the wrong result. Now, obviously, I think it's the wrong result, but when I say wrong result there, I mean not the one that people who called it intended. It was meant to deal with that internal party political wrangle. It didn't. So immediately have an issue there. The Tory party created more division within itself, created more division within the country. The Prime Minister upped and left and was replaced with just the greyest, most compromised candidate, and the most compromised and grey Prime Minister I think we've had since John Major, who weirdly has become something of a firebrand on radio and things since Brexit. So that's one big part of why it's fucked. The next thing to consider in why it's fucked is that everyone in the political machine knows and understands that this is a poison pill. It's like playing pass the parcel with a ticking time bomb. You never know when it's going to go off. So you want to maybe hold on to it to the last second and then pass it to someone you hate, or maybe you just want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And it moves around, and you can see all the manoeuvring between the different wings of the Tory party and how Labour and the Liberal Democrats have reacted to it, and how Farage and UKIP have reacted to it. Nobody really wants to be responsible for the harm, but a lot of them are playing this populist game. They feel that they have to deliver it because that's what the people decided. But as time goes on, what the people want has changed consistently. It's now pretty consistently understood that the vote has at least reversed. And the more time goes on, the more that trend continues, with people changing their minds and coming out against it and so forth. So we're stuck implementing a decision from 2016 because they know it's political suicide to not do Brexit, or not to attempt Brexit, but it's also political suicide to deliver it because it's going to fuck everything. When we consider the Tory party in particular, they also have a bunch of issues in that there are some leading donors who are anti-EU, and there are other leading donors, Conservative Party being the party of business, who their businesses are under threat. They stand to lose a great deal of money. Many of these people who have otherwise backed the Tory party. So you've got big issues there. May did call an election around all this, and that also proved to be a supremely bad move because it knocked a huge dent in her majorities, to the point where she's had to ally with other parties, something which is unusual in British politics, though more recently it's become more common, in order to try and get anything of her agenda through. And this has meant she has ended up allying with the Democratic Unionist Party. This is a Northern Ireland only party, and it's a party of loyalists, those who want Northern Ireland to remain part of the broader UK. Ireland is a big, huge issue as well. See, Northern Ireland is still part of the UK. Southern Ireland is its own independent nation. The UK and Ireland are currently both members of the European Union, which means everyone was able to travel freely between Northern and Southern Ireland. And this rapprochement, this coming together through the European Union, really helped dispel the troubles, the Irish terrorism, the ongoing struggle for Irish independence from the Republicans in the north. It allowed a kind of fudge, a hedge, that things would continue very, very slowly, perhaps, towards them hiving off from the rest of the UK and becoming a fully united Ireland. But there's plenty of loyalists who are still very much against this. And if we leave the European Union, suddenly you go from two countries with a land border in Northern Ireland that could freely travel between each other, to one where there is a border, which is going to be at the very least a customs border, an immigration border and so on. And this is probably the biggest and worst problem, the biggest roadblock in the way of the UK Brexiting, at least relatively successfully. Because we stand to maybe lose Northern Ireland far more quickly than necessarily we want to. We stand perhaps to have Irish terrorism resurging if we have a hard border with troops and police and checkpoints and whatever else. And yet, if we don't put some kind of customs or other border there, then we may as well not leave the common movement area or anything else, because there's just going to be this path in through Ireland. So that's a big problem. We're also going to be in a much weaker trading position. So one particular thing of note with that is Trump has suggested that he will do some kind of free trade deal after we leave the EU, but already there are demands on the table that we relax our food standards to allow things like rat droppings and maggots and mould to a certain extent within food that we would then import from the States. Things like chlorinated chicken have grabbed the headlines. Food standards in the UK and the EU are pretty important, and for all the people brag on Britain for its cuisine, it has become much better in recent years. So, all of that considered, even if you're pro-Brexit, I think you understand that there is going to be economic and political damage to whoever carries it out. There's also going to be severe political damage to some party, if they don't carry it out. And we don't have leaders, we have populist windsocks at the moment. So they can't deliver Brexit and survive politically. They can't stymie Brexit and survive politically. Right. So what do you do in that situation? The reason I'm making this video today is that Theresa May has kind of tested the waters on the negotiations being extended for a few months, perhaps as much as a year. This is interesting because we haven't made much progress in negotiations. They do appear to be stuck in an impasse, and there isn't really enough time left to come to any sort of final agreement with the EU. So an extension, whether you're for Brexit or for Remain, makes sense to a degree, but a lot of the pro-Brexit forces have come out very much against this. Why? Because I think public attitudes towards Brexit are shifting very much from that narrow pro-leave margin to a much stronger pro-Remain margin as time goes on, as things become more clear, as the chaos and so on becomes clearer. So the people who want a Brexit, I think, understand that time is not in their favour as the People's Vote campaign builds up momentum and so on. So they want to just barge ahead and maybe go as far as a no-deal Brexit, which would be disastrous for everybody. But you can understand tactically where they're coming from when they suggest that. Labour, meanwhile, and some of the other parties, I mean, under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour is not, at least in its leadership, particularly pro-Remain. He views it as a globalist, capitalistic enterprise rather than an internationalist one, whereas the more new Labour wing is much more pro-Remain. And the Labour membership is way overwhelmingly pro-Remain. It's only the leadership that is pro-leave. I think the game that Labour is playing, why then kind of almost propping up the government in a lot of ways, kind of sniping from the sidelines without making a firm commitment to anything either way. I think they understand that if the government is forced to capitulate and not follow through on Brexit, they will suffer at the polls and Labour may swoop into power. And they understand if the government does bring in Brexit, if we do leave, the economic chaos and so on will all be pinned on that party and they may be unelectable for a generation. So Labour can swoop in there. I don't think that's putting the interests of the country first, but you can understand politically why they might want to do that. Over on the Tory side, you have a group of increasingly more vocal pro-Remain MPs. You have a very, very vocal group of pro-Leave MPs who have ambitions on the leadership and so on, and they're very divided, and both sides are willing to rebel against the executive, against Theresa May, against what she tries to put forward in order to achieve their own ends. And because she has such a razor-thin margin, and because the issues are so contentious, she's basically fucked. There is no way for her to win. She's floated this idea of extension, I think, in order to kick things into the long grass and allow more time for the country to more decisively turn against Brexit, and to make it more possible to accept the idea of a people's vote, to give in to that and hope that we either get the opportunity to reverse this or to push it through with a kind of second sort of stamp of approval from the public on it, and the willingness with the terms and the damage and so on much better understood. You know, for people to say, yeah, we're willing to put up with this to get out of the EU. I think that's what's going on. Will she be able to extend things? That would rely on the EU agreeing to extend the negotiations, and I think it would rely on Parliament agreeing to extend the negotiations. And there again, you have the problem. It might be in Labour's interest to go against that vote in order to force the Tories to make one of those two bad decisions and therefore lose out at the polls. Also, the pro-Leave people on the Tory side will want to vote down such a vote because they want to push forward, because they can tell which way the wind is blowing. So, interesting times. The Irish problem cannot be solved easily. It's not clear what anyone can offer to do with that. And it's all party politics again. The good of the nation, what's best for people is simply not being done. And we have a tradition in the UK of Parliament being sovereign, which means Parliament is supposed to rule and be the final say on anything. Not a referendum, not the Queen, not anybody else, just Parliament. And they're arguing for a meaningful vote. But again, this whole populism thing just means that there's no leadership. So in my opinion, the only viable solution that will minimise the risk of civil disruption and terrorism and other issues is to extend things, allow more time for public opinion to shift against Brexit, hold a people's vote. Hopefully, from my point of view, that would come down saying, actually, no, we've decided that we're not going to do this fundamentally stupid and moronic thing, and we're going to stay in the EU, and then for a government to follow through on that. That is the least risk for whatever political party does it. It's the best thing for the economics of the country. It's the most progressive and forward-thinking thing. It's the only navigable path I can see through this trash. And if it did go against me in that second vote, at least we would then have an informed decision from the populace, understanding, seeing, knowing more, as we've found out in the past 2 years, about what all this means, what the effects actually will be, how hollow a lot of the promises were, how hollow some of the threats were. So that's the only way I see forward. Extend the time, eventually cave to a people's vote, and uphold the result of that vote, that informed vote, whatever it might be. Zang. Please leave questions in the comments. I will attempt to answer them in a follow-up video at some point, so I might not necessarily reply in the comments, but if you've got particular questions, do fire them off down there. Ciao.
The police bring in reinforcements.
There was justice there, no poverty, and no
see, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity. Yeah!